Hey everyone, and welcome. You know, when you see pictures of ancient Egypt, you see these massive, incredible ruins, right? But what if I told you they're not just piles of stone? They're actually sacred blueprints, a kind of language that spells out exactly what the Egyptians believed about life, death, and the gods. So let's get into it. Let's learn to read the language of the stones.
Okay, so let's start with a really basic question, one you've probably wondered about. We throw around the words tomb and temple all the time when we talk about Egypt, but what's the actual difference? I mean, they're both huge stone buildings, right? But their purpose, their whole reason for being, was completely different. One was built for the dead, and the other? That was for the gods. So, first things first. For an ancient Egyptian, maybe the biggest deal in their entire life was making sure they had a safe trip to the afterlife. I mean, it was everything, and that obsession shaped their earliest sacred buildings. It was all about one thing, making a permanent, super protected home for both the body and the spirit after death. And the original blueprint for that? It was this thing called the mastaba. Yeah, forget pyramids for just a second. The mastaba was the OG model, the seed that all those grander tombs later grew from. At first, they were just simple mud brick, but later they used stone to make them last. And you know, getting the mastaba was a huge deal. It was pretty much only for early royalty and the super elite. It was a status symbol, built to last forever. Okay, now this is where it gets really cool. Take a look at this cutaway. You can see just how smart this design was. On the outside, yeah, it's pretty simple. Rectangular, flat top, those trademark sloping walls. But the magic is inside. See that deep vertical shaft? That leads way down to the burial chamber to keep the mummies safe and sound. And look, there are other rooms too. Little chambers for offerings, and even this super special sealed-off room called a serdab. That's where they'd put a statue of the person. So you see, this thing wasn't just a big fancy coffin. It was a machine, a whole support system for the afterlife, taking care of both the body and the spirit, what they called the Ka. So we've got a blueprint for the dead covered, but what about the gods? I mean, they needed a place to hang out on Earth, right? A spot where people could worship them and, connect with the divine. And that brings us to our next major blueprint, the temple. And for this, we have the perfect example, the Temple of Khonsu. It's this gem tucked away inside the absolutely enormous Karnak temple complex. This one was for the moon god Khonsu, and what's so great is that it's incredibly well preserved. It's what's called a New Kingdom cult temple, and it has all the classic bits and pieces. It's basically the perfect textbook example for understanding how these homes for the gods were set up. And check this out. This layout shows how entering a temple was like going on a journey. Imagine you're walking through it, from left to right. First, you hit the pylon, this massive, towering gateway. It's meant to separate the messy, chaotic world outside from the holy space inside. Step through, and you're in the courtyard, an open-air area where pretty much anyone could go. But then you move deeper, into the hypostyle hall, and wow, it's like a forest of giant columns. The light gets dimmer, and it starts to feel way more exclusive. And then, at the very back, the final stop, the sanctuary. This was the holiest of holies, a dark, small room where the actual statue of the god lived, and only the most high-ranking priests were ever allowed in there. Every single step you take brings you deeper into a more sacred, more private world. Okay, but here's the wrinkle. What happens when the king isn't just a king? What if he's also seen as a god? Well, then your blueprints have to change, right? And that's exactly what happened. This led to a whole new kind of building, a sort of hybrid, the mortuary temple. Its job wasn't just about burying the pharaoh. It was designed to make sure people would worship him as a god forever. And the guy who really kicked this off was Mentuhotep II. He was a big deal. He reunited Egypt, started the Middle Kingdom. And to celebrate, he built something totally revolutionary at a place called Deir el-Bahari. Instead of building another flat temple on the desert floor, he built it into the cliffs. He used these amazing terraces that rise up the cliff face. It was a game changer. So much so that it was the direct inspiration for one of the most famous buildings in all of Egypt, the Temple of Hatshepsut, which was built right next to it hundreds of years later. But, not all of these god kings had the same style. You had Mentuhotep, the innovator, who wanted his temple to blend in with the landscape. And then you had someone like Ramesses II. You probably know him as Ramesses the Great. His mortuary temple, called the Ramesseum, was all about one thing and one thing only: pure, jaw-dropping scale. It was just a massive monument to his own power, his own ego, his own glory.
And you can still feel that ambition for size today. The Ramesseum is probably most famous now for this gigantic statue of Ramesses that's fallen over and shattered. And this exact scene, this broken giant in the sand, actually inspired the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley to write his famous poem Ozymandias. It's all about how power and glory fade, how even the mightiest rulers end up as dust. So when you hear that famous line, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair," yeah, that was inspired by the ruins of Ramesses' temple.
So, we've talked about buildings for death and buildings for worship, but the Egyptians didn't stop there. They also built to celebrate life, creation, and birth. And that leads us to this really fascinating, very specific kind of temple. It's called a mamnisi, which literally means birth house. Now, these weren't huge temples. They were smaller, really beautiful shrines that you'd often find attached to a much bigger temple. And they had one very special job: to ritually celebrate the birth of a child god. Why? Well, it was a huge deal for reinforcing the idea that the current pharaoh was divine, that he was part of this cosmic cycle of creation and rebirth. It's a really lovely idea to build a whole building just for that. So, when you put it all together, what's the big takeaway? It's that all of these buildings, from a relatively simple tomb for some rich guy, all the way up to a colossal temple for a god king, each one is a chapter in a much bigger story. The stones are literally speaking to us about what this amazing civilization cared about most: eternity, the gods, and their own legacy. All right, let's just do a quick recap to lock it all in. Here's a simple chart. First, you have the mastaba, right? That's the tomb for the nobility. Then you have the cult temple, like the Temple of Khonsu, which was the standard house for a god. Then the mortuary temple, the place to worship a divine pharaoh, whether you're an innovator like Mentuhotep or a mega builder like Ramesses. And finally, the sweet little Mamisi, the birth house that celebrated divine cycles. See? 4 totally different blueprints, each one designed for a very specific sacred purpose. So, in the end, it's pretty clear that ancient Egyptian architecture wasn't just one style. It was a whole language written in stone. They didn't just build big for the sake of it. No, they built with incredible intention. Every single structure had a purpose, and every stone had its own part of the story to tell. And that kind of leaves us with one last big question to think about. If a civilization's buildings really are its story written in stone, what story are we building today? I mean, what will our skyscrapers, our stadiums, our shopping malls, and our houses say about us in a few thousand years? What are our secret blueprints?